Unlike the previous two speakers, I'm not going to focus my remarks on China, but on Asia as a whole, or the Indo-Pacific as we now call it. The topic is tremendously appropriate because Asian leaders in particular understand that economic growth produces not only jobs, but stability, legitimacy, and regional and global reputation. So I'm going to talk broadly about economic trends, but they, of course, overlap with some of what you have heard and will hear. I have a feeling that Asians are sensing uncertainty and risk. The four basic pillars that have contributed so much to Asia's remarkable growth and a relative stability over the last few decades are all somewhat questionable. I would name these four pillars as China's rapid growth and market opening, a relatively open U.S. market, participation in global value chains, especially China-centered production networks in which many Asian countries have found a niche, and undergirding all that, the fourth pillar, of course, the presence of the United States military as an implicit guarantor of freedom of transit in the South China Sea, which is vital to all of the countries of the region. When I was thinking about what to say to you today, I went through piles and piles of stuff. And I picked out three trends that I thought would be particularly germane to the future of Asia in 2030. The first is the ongoing regional economic integration. It's slow and it's boring, but it's very, very real and has contributed a great deal to Asians. Most of you are probably holding something that looks like this. This is an iPhone, and here is a schematic of the different parts and components that go into this iPhone. If I asked you, where do you think it comes from, a lot of you would say, China. But in fact, in this particular case, there are 2 or 3 other countries involved in this, so that made in China is kind of a misleading notion. We have, sorry, I keep doing something wrong here. There. In other electronic components, the Philippines have a niche. Korea, Taiwan, Japan all contribute parts. So there's really, it's really a misnomer in the electronics case to talk about made in China. When it comes to clothing and things like that, it's probably Bangladesh or Vietnam. So there's a great network that Asians have participated in. Oops, sorry. Why do I do that? There we go. Okay, so some of this is private sector driven, but a good deal of it is government driven, top-down regional integration. The 10 nations of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, started some time back in the 90s to promote free trade agreements with the major powers of the region: China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, sometimes called the 10+6. And more recently, there's an effort to take all of these 16 countries and create a single agreement covering them all, called RCEP, or the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership. From a U.S. perspective, and the U.S. is not in this group, the standards are much too low. It mainly centers on goods, and doesn't have enforcement and so forth. But nevertheless, it's part of this ongoing effort to break down barriers within Asian countries. The high standard agreement, of course, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Why, I don't know. But this is the agreement that the United States dropped out of, and you can see the regional effect. This is a very high standards agreement. In fact, we shouldn't even really be talking just about trade, because of the 29 or so substantive chapters of the TPP, only about 4 deal with tariffs and quotas. Everything else is behind the border barriers, so-called, intellectual property protection, treatment of state-owned enterprises, a whole lot of other barriers, investment, theft of intellectual property, protection of IP. All of these things are in the TPP, but not in but not in RCEP. But nevertheless, the two are proceeding together. There was also an effort to cope with the financial collapse that hit Asia, Indonesia in particular, and Thailand in 1997. So there were a whole bunch of bilateral currency swap agreements. This spaghetti diagram has now been so-called multilateralized, meaning that countries are supposed to keep reserves in their foreign currency basket to help others if there's a speculative run on the currencies. Japan has taken the lead in this kind of area because their financial skills are better than others. There's the APEC, which centers mainly on sort of technology and business issues. That's been going on for a long time and does useful work. This, in sum, is kind of what they call the spaghetti bowl or the noodle bowl. It's an example of all of the different agreements and discussions going on within Asia. The ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, that one deals explicitly with security. So the point I want to make here is that this is an ongoing trend, and although there isn't, a whole lot that's new, there are a few things that are new. One, of course, is that the U.S. has dropped out. Another one is that there's a big focus now on connectivity. That means ports, railways, feeder roads, electrical grids, enabling countries to trade more with each other, and especially around the Bay of Bengal, and all promoted by the Asian Development Bank. I guess the only change I would think is relatively new is that there are companies that are beginning to pull out of China, or at least make new investments somewhere else. Partly because conditions in China have gotten more difficult, as we heard, and partly because since the Trump administration seems ginning up all these trade sanctions against China, they don't want their products to be labeled made in China. So they're going to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia and other places. And that, I think, is a shift. I don't see investment coming in production networks coming back to China to the same degree as it was before. So that's one trend. The second one is new or intensified economic statecraft, by which I mean the use of economic tools to achieve favorable geopolitical outcomes or to enhance one's own resilience. And the tools are very diverse, from trade and investment, sanctions, export controls, withholding of key commodities, manipulation of foreign exchange rates, even, as you heard earlier, withholding group tourist visas, or allowing, in one case, a whole shipload of Philippine bananas to rot in the sun because China was angry at the Philippine decision to file a case for arbitration in The Hague on the South China Sea disputes. So there's lots and lots of coercive statecraft, but there's also positive statecraft that has, I think, intensified, become at least more visible. Most obvious one, of course, is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, followed also by the Belt and Road Initiative, both coming out of China. The AIIB does have fairly high standards compared to what we all feared that it would turn into. Belt and Road Initiative, we don't really have a whole lot of details. We can't really find any contracts, nor do we know whether bidding on it will be open and transparent. A lot of it has been going on already and just given a more glamorous name because China has significant overcapacity in the construction industry, and this is a nice way to earn goodwill and keep the construction industry going all at once. Of course, there are also stepped up foreign aid from China and certain amount of debt forgiveness. The debt trap has been mentioned. That is a serious issue. So there's a sort of sunshine aspect to China's behavior that I don't think came out quite as much as it should in Aaron Friedberg's presentation. But the thing I really think is new, and I really want to get this across, is that Japan has become a significant player in economic statecraft, backed by by a concern about rivalry with China. This is the AIIB, the BRICS Bank, One Belt, One Road. There's been some pushback from people like Mahathir, who's now 93, I think, and is talking about new colonialism. So there's, again, a sort of pushback that I think is important, and diversification away from China. This is the photo I couldn't resist showing you. Take a look at the contrast between Abe meeting Modi and Abe meeting Xi Jinping. Japan is a significant player in Asia, always has been in the area of foreign aid for decades, basically since the 50s. But now Abe in particular has taken on the challenge of China in a very clear way. In the first year of his current term, he visited all 10 ASEAN countries in 1 year. Japan has also done two things that I think are significant in the economic realm. One is it has something called the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. Get it? Quality infrastructure. Taking advantage of the fact that Chinese infrastructure projects have often been accused of slipshod construction or pollution, a bunch of things. The Japanese are coming along, and the countries of the region are often inviting Japan in as a balancer. Modi has invited Japan to invest in the northeastern states. Jokowi in Indonesia has invited the Japanese in to do certain kinds of things. So one whole type of activity is under this PQI, Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. But another big one happened at the Asian Development Bank. This is sometimes nicknamed a Japanese bank because the head of it is always Japanese and there's a lot of Japanese influence in it. Essentially, they have merged most of the two major accounts in the bank, which gives them enormously more leverage and more ability to lend. And so the ADB itself, which tries to uphold standards of transparency, accountability, and so on, is become much more active in Asia, especially in this field of connectivity, as they call it. So that's all new, and I think pretty much positive. Where is the United States? Well, there isn't a whole lot there. Withdrawal from the TPP. On July 30th, Secretary Pompeo announced some initiatives, pitiful in size if you just looked at that, $113 million. But it's designed to attract private sector participation. In all of these Asian countries, there's huge infrastructure and other needs, but they're not considered bankable, as they say. So how can you attract the private sector, which has the technology and the savings? So the third trend that I wanted to mention has been touched on also by Professor Friedberg and the questioner, but there's also growing income inequality among the different states of Asia, which can be worrisome. Within Southeast Asia alone, the distribution of wealth is highly unequal. You can see Singapore at the very top. If you have been to see the movie or read the book Crazy Rich Asians, you get an idea of the amount of money that's washing around at the top of a number of these countries. And this is a very common view of an Asian city with gleaming skyscrapers in the background and sort of shanties or slums in the foreground here. There is this super rich class. Recession? What recession? Luxury spending in Asia is really phenomenal. So I think that's a problem for a number of reasons. Inequality within the region runs the risk of countries becoming susceptible to bullying because a two-track system is going to be set up. The richer countries getting richer all the time, and the poorer countries marginalized, perhaps through their own doing. I'm thinking of Laos, People's Democratic Republic, and Cambodia, for example, that are being left behind. Splitting up ASEAN into a two-track system enhances the risk of bullying. China has always wanted bilateral agreements with countries instead of negotiating with ASEAN as a whole. So that's one of the risks. And of course, there is considerable evidence that income inequality within a country contributes to instability, and a sense of injustice, which can lead to insurgencies and outside interventions and so forth, all of which would deter future economic growth quite significantly. What are the risks ahead? I happen to be a skeptic about this term Asian century, but we won't go there yet. Well, the obvious one right now is the US-China trade dispute. When two elephants fight, the grass suffers. And I showed you at the beginning that a number of these countries have found niches within China-centered production networks. And so to the extent that exports from China are cut back, their short-term needs are not met. In the medium term, however, this diversification out of China that I mentioned could help them a lot, but it's just too hard to say where this is all going. Even Indonesia, which is a poor country and has opened up a lot, was hit by some of the Trump sanctions in the early days of the administration. The risk of global financial volatility seems to me quite a significant risk to the prosperity of Asia in 2030. I mean, this could take the form of financial crises, currency volatility, commodity price booms and busts, bubbles. There's just a whole lot of things. Some people think that China's headed for hard times, a hard landing, which would be very bad for lots of reasons, or that the U.S. itself is in a bubble phase of irrational exuberance leading to a crash. I don't predict that, but you can't rule it out completely. And we saw the damage it did in 1997 and in 2008. The rise of, I don't know if you can read that, territorial exclusive economic zone claims, economic crimes. These are definitely a problem in the region. I think they're increasing to some extent when resources like fisheries are involved. People can start shooting at each other. They actually do. You can see that fishing boats, Chinese fishing boats in this case, have become fairly high-tech. They've got modern communications technology behind them. And then sort of off to the little bit behind them is the Coast Guard, which has, as you can see, has also become a very far cry from the Coast Guard of my childhood, which really consisted of people with an outboard motor trying to rescue people. It's a very high-tech business now. And behind the Coast Guard is sometimes the People's Liberation Army Navy. So there's a sort of a cabbage leaf, as they call it. You peel away one layer and you get something quite ominous. So there's a danger of unplanned escalation and violence aided by the diffusion of cheap, smart weapons. This technology that we're all thrilled about can lend itself to very dangerous purposes. Illegal trafficking has been a problem for a long time. There are Asian countries that cooperate with each other on piracy and fisheries, but cooperation is not what it should be. They do have joint exercises with the United States against some of these economic crimes, but when it comes to actual action, they tend to not to want to share sovereignty. So I blame this as a threat to the so-called Asian century. This is sort of a futuristic threat, but robots, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, this is something made with a 3D printer on the right, could threaten Asian countries because they're not investing sufficiently in the level of skill to be able to cope with the next generation of manufacturing. So that's sort of out there. So these are the three implications, I'd say. At least two of them have been mentioned already. We need to overcome stovepipe thinking, which is economists are over here and security planners over there. I think we've come a long way. Our own country and national security strategy and Obama administration documents also begin to integrate the two kinds of thinking, but there needs to be more. We need a coordinated approach to all of these China-related issues. And in Asia itself, there's a very strong need to get on with domestic reform and education to achieve inclusive economic growth. Well, what about the U.S.? You might say, physician, heal thyself. Thank you.